With Hashem's help, we will learn today Yevamos Daf Gimel Amud Aleph, a quick recap of the din of the Mishnah. First of all, there are 21 arayos, meaning there are 21 women that have a close kinship, with whom one is not allowed to have a relation. And if one violates and has this relation with them, then if it was done on purpose, the punishment for both of them is qadis. Some of them not only get qadis, but also receive capital punishment. It might be through stoning, through skila, or through getting burnt, sreifa, or headache, getting killed with a sword, or chenek, or getting strangled. More details of the meaning of skila, sreifa, headache, and chenek we will, Emirz Hashem, learn together in Masechta Sanhedrin. Now, one of the 21 prohibited arayos is for a man to have a relation with his brother's wife. This specific prohibition gets overruled in a scenario when a brother who is married passes away while he is childless. His brother or any one of his brothers have actually a mitzvah of yibum, of marrying the brother's widow. Obviously, mitzvah, you're not violating an erva of Eishes Ach. So the Mishnah wants to clarify and let you know that the only erva that is overruled, the only erva that is suspended, perhaps the only erva that completely goes away when a brother dies, is for any one of his brothers to marry the widow, is the erva of Achais, of Eishes Ach, but none other of the ervas are going to be overruled, are going to be suspended. They stand in place. Actually, if a widow is prohibited on the living brother through any one of the ervas, and as the Mishnah points out, there are 15 possibilities of her being an erva with the living brother, then one is prohibited to do yibum. In other words, yibum is not applicable, and whenever yibum is not applicable, neither is chalitza applicable. That was the din of the Mishnah. And the question is, where do we know it from? Where do we know that if the widow is an erva, aside of being Eishes Ach, then the din of yibum is suspended, and therefore chalitza as well? And we will see Emirz Hashem in today's daf, in a braisa, that is learned out from the erva of one is not allowed to marry the sister of one's wife. So if you have two sisters, Leah and Rachel, when someone married Leah, whether he is still married to Leah, or even if he divorced Leah, but his wife or his ex-wife is still living, he's prohibited to marry, to have a relation with his wife's sister. So one of the cases the Mishnah gave was that two brothers marry two sisters, and one brother passes away childless. So the living brother is not allowed to marry, not allowed to do yibum with the widow, because she is achos isha, and it is there that there is a pasuk that articulates, that tells us that even b'makom yibum, the erva of eishes of achos isha still stands. In other words, the din of the Mishnah is learned from achos isha. So ask the Gemara regarding the order that the Mishnah gave to the 15 possible ervas of the widow to the yavam. Michdi, behold, kulu ma'achos isha yalfinan, being that the din of the Mishnah of the exemption of making yibum when there is an erva is learned from the erva of achos isha, of one not being allowed to marry one's wife's sister, even if she falls in yibum. So the question of the Gemara is regarding the order, regarding the Seder of the Mishnah. Litani achos isha bereisha. The first example of the 15 arayos that the Mishnah gave was bita, right? To bas bita, right? The daughter, the granddaughter, through the daughter, the granddaughter, through the daughter, through the son. Why didn't the Mishnah say this the first? And answers the Gemara, v'chi teiman, if you're going to answer, Tana chumrei nakit, and v'Rab Shimon Amar Sreifa Chamura, that the reason of the order of our Mishnah is not, the Mishnah is ordering things on their stringent violation. As we mentioned before, that from the 21 arayas, most of them bear a punishment of kares, which is a terrible punishment. Or if the relation was b'shoigig, bringing a karban chatos. But some of them also carry a capital punishment. Within the ones that carry a capital punishment, there is a group of them that have the punishment of getting burnt, sreifa. Others carry the punishment of skila, of being stoned. Now there is a machlok, as a Masechta Sanhedrin, between the Chachamim and Ab Shimon regarding from the 4 capital punishments of skila, sreifa, hedeg, and chenig, which one is considered the most strict one, the most chamer one. And Rab Shimon, unlike the Chachamim, hold that the punishment of sreifa, of getting burnt, is the most strict, is the most severe. Being that the punishment of having a relation with one's daughter isn't only kares, but there's also a capital punishment of sreifa. So perhaps the author of our Mishnah is Rab Shimon, that holds that sreifa is the most chamer from all the 4 capital punishments through a basin. And that's why the group of daughter and granddaughter is mentioned before Achos Isha. So the Gemara counters that cannot be the answer, because if that would have been the case, litanei chamoisoi b'reisha, that the Mishnah who counts the prohibition of marrying one's mother-in-law. In other words, there was a woman who's married, who has a daughter, and she gets divorced, or her husband passes away, and a man married his daughter. Reuven married this woman's daughter. She's a single woman now, because either she's a widow or because she's divorced. Comes along Shimon and marries the mother-in-law, and then Shimon dies childless. Mother-in-law falls to Yibum, and the Mishnah says he's not allowed to do Yibum. He's exempt from Yibum and exempt from Chalitza. Being that, from where do we know that there is the punishment of getting burnt by the case of a daughter or of a granddaughter? All of that is only learned out from the explicit mention of the Torah that there is a punishment of burning by having a relation with one's mother-in-law. So the Mishnah should have mentioned the prohibition of mother-in-law first. The Iker Sreifa b'chamois eksiva, and the Mishnah mentions it the 7th. Should have been the 1st. And furthermore, if the reason of the order of the Mishnah has to do with the severity of the capital punishment, after the Mishnah mentions chamoisai, that one is exempt of Yibum and Chalitza with one's mother-in-law, the next level, which is one level down, even according to Rab Shimon, is the punishment of being stoned, skila, litani kalasai. The 15th erva mentioned in the Mishnah is the possibility when a person will have a zika, will have an attachment to one's daughter-in-law, because the daughter-in-law, who was married to the son and the son died, now married his brother, and now the brother died. So now there's a connection between him and his daughter-in-law that should have been mentioned right afterwards, because the basar sreifa skila chamura, even according to Rab Shimon. So back to the question, why the Gemara is trying to understand why the Mishnah ordered the 15 arayos the way that it did. So the Gemara says the following, Ella, you should know, a very interesting rule, that the reason why the Mishnah mentioned the case of Bitoi was mentioned first, one's daughter was mentioned first, Kivan the Asya Midrasha, being that the Torah never explicitly said that a man cannot have a relation with his daughter. She's an erva. And as we mentioned in the Mishnah, there's 2 scenarios of a prohibition with one's daughter. There is a prohibition for a man to have a relation with his wife's daughter, whether he's the biological father or not. It's bas ishtoi. There, the Torah explicitly says you cannot have a relation with one's wife's daughter. And then there's another scenario where a person can have a daughter out of wedlock. And even there, the Torah prohibits one having a relation with his daughter, but that is not written explicitly. Explicitly, the Torah writes that if a person has a child out of wedlock and they have daughters, with them, the Torah says explicitly, Ervas bas bincha, Ervas bas bitecha, loisigala ervasan. The Torah only mentioned granddaughters. The Torah didn't mention daughters explicitly.
Why does it have to be out of wedlock?
Because if it is with marriage, why did the Torah have to mention you can't have a relation with your daughter when the Torah already mentioned you can't have a relation with your wife's daughter? Now, the wife's daughter also includes that you married her when she already had a daughter. That's also an erva. But it also will include if you're married to her and you had a daughter with her, she's your wife's daughter. And that's already written, you can't have a relation. So when the Torah writes you can't have a relation with your wife's daughter and with her daughters or with her granddaughters, whether it is through a daughter or whether it is through a son. So daughter and granddaughters, both generations I mentioned with the wife. When the Torah doesn't speak about a wife, when the Torah just speaks about a man with his own, the Torah doesn't mention the first generation for some reason. The Torah only mentions the second generation. You can have a relation with your granddaughter through your son or through your daughter. The Torah doesn't mention your daughter. So it's learned out from a drush, as we'll see in a moment. We learned this together in Masechtas Chagiga. And there's a rule that something that the Chachamim learn out on their own from a drush, it's more beloved on the sages. By the very fact that we so to say, we partnered with Hashem to come to the din. So the Gemara counters, that's not a good answer. Why isn't it a good answer? Because kulu nami midrasha asu. The whole din of the Mishnah, that a person is exempt, that yibum is not applicable if the widow is an erva, aside of, the only exception is the erva of your brother's wife. As we just started today's share, and as God willing we'll learn in Daf Gimel Amud Beis, that the only place where the Torah writes that there is an exemption of yibum b'makim erva is only in the erva of your wife's sister. All of the other 14 possibilities, there the Torah did not say that you are exempt. One could have argued that just like your wife's sister is the only erva.
Brother's wife.
No, your wife's sister. That means that if yibum, if who's the woman, the widow, and now the living brother, if the widow is the living brother's wife's sister, not only is she the brother's wife, but she's also the wife's sister, it is only there that the Torah said that yibum should not be done. But how do we know the other 14 arroyas are exempt if it's an erva? We learn it from the wife's sister. So there's also a drash for everything. So everything is learned out midrasha. So everything should be chaviv and the Tana. So answers the Gemara, Nehi, correct, that the le'inyan yibum asyon midrasha, when it comes to the exemption of performing yibum, and therefore no need more for chalitza, if the widow is any other of the arayas, it's learned from the drush from Achais Isha. Nevertheless, ikiri surayu behed yaksiv. But all the other arayas are explicitly written. The prohibition of the arayas are written. A man can have a relation with his wife's sister. A man can have a relation with his mother-in-law. A man can have a relation with his daughter-in-law. However, bitoi, but when it comes to the prohibition of an erva with one's daughter out of wedlock, ikiri surah is midrasha. That was never written explicitly. And again, we learned this at the end of the first Perek of Chagiga. Remember there in the top, Taf Yudal from the base. The Amar Rava says that Amali Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi. That how do we learn it from Asya? It's learned out from a Gzeira Shava from the words Heina Heina, and then from a Gzeira Shava from the words Zima Zima. So what are the words over here? When it comes to a person having a relation with one's own daughter out of wedlock, it says Ervas Bas Bincha or Bas Bitecha. And it doesn't say bitcha. It says bas bincha, bas bitcha. Then it says at the end, loy segala ervasan. Then it says ki ervascha heina. Now when it comes to not having a relation with one's wife's daughters or granddaughters, there it says ervas isha, ubita, and then ubas bita. Then it says sha'ara heina. Right, sha'ara means that this is a close relative. Zimahi. It's a deprive act. So you learn from the daughter of your wife, the wife's daughter, we learn from there to one's own daughter out of wedlock. Just like over there, it's not only the granddaughters, it's also the daughter. Here also, it's also the daughter. That's heina, that we learn that it's prohibited to have a relation with one's own daughter. Now, even though we learn from there the isur, what about the punishment? Like we mentioned, not all the arois carry, aside of Kares, the punishment of getting killed by a Beis Din. But if a person has a relation with one's daughter, there is also a capital punishment of Sreifa. And where is that learned from? Because there's another pasuk that says, V'isha ki yikach es isha ve'es ima. That a man is not allowed to marry his wife and her mother, that's Tchamaisa. That's the mother-in-law. And there the pasuk says, Zimahi. that it's a deprive act, and in the case of a man not being allowed to have a relation with his wife's daughter or granddaughter, the Torah says the word zima. So zima teaches us that just like with the mother-in-law, there's a punishment of sreifa, with the daughter or granddaughter from the wife, sreifa, and whatever is by the wife's daughter or granddaughter goes to one's own daughter or granddaughter. In other words, all this is learned through Gzeirah Shabbos. So that's the proposed answer. That's why the Mishnah mentions the stanza of Bita first, because it's learned out of a drash, it's not explicitly written, and anything which the Chachamim needed to use their own input to come to a conclusion, to come to a halacha, was beloved on them. There's an interesting remez for that. When it comes to a mitzvah of bris milah, there are three parts of a bris. And if any one is missing, the bris is not kosher. You have the actual milah, the cutting off of the arla, then you have the priya, then you have metzitza. That, what is written clearly in the Torah is cutting off the arla. What is learned from a drash, it's hinted to, is the idea of priya, pulling down with your hands the light membrane even after you cut off the arla, that still is there. And then metzitza is mamash only a tradition that we have from Moshe Rabbeinu. It's an oral tradition. So they say that what do you do a bris milah with? How do you cut the arla? You're the most distant from it. You cut it with a knife. How do you do priya? With your hands. It's closer to you. How do you do metzitza? With your mouth. Because the less it's written, the more we needed our own drash, and even more than that, if we needed a total Kabbalah and Messiah, you don't even have a hint. So it's more chavev on us. So this is a knife, this is already done with your hands, and that's done with your mouth. Alright. Now says the Gemara, so the Gemara still asks, that's not a good answer. If the logic will be that the order of the Mishnah is based on that which is learned from a drash, is more beloved on the Tana, litana la'achois isha l'basoif. So which one is written clearly? Which erva that is exempt from yibum, we don't even need a drash for? The erva of your wife's sister, as we'll see soon in the Braisa and Nav Gimel Amud Beis, that it is there that the Torah writes that if the widow is also your wife's sister, don't do yibum. You are exempt of yibum, and therefore you are exempt of chalitza. The Torah says that clearly. That should have been the last one mentioned in the Mishnah.
Is that a capital punishment? Your wife's sister?
I don't know. I don't remember. But that's not the point. The point here is not about chumrah capital. This approach is
saying it explicitly.
Correct. So the Gemara says, really, you're right. However, the reason the Mishnah mentions achois isha as the 12th and not the 15th, because if you'll notice that the Mishnah groups categories together. Like when the Mishnah began with the daughter. So the Mishnah gave your daughter, your son's daughter, and your daughter's daughter. Then it gives your wife's daughter, your wife's son's daughter, your wife's daughter's daughter. It grouped daughters in groups. Here we mentioned the whole group of sisters. So when we're speaking about arroyas that are connected to brotherhood or sisterhood, so in that group, we put in the case of your wife's sister. The whole group should have been mentioned last. Answers the Gemara, Ella, this is the final answer, after none of the above attempts worked. So we're going to give the final answer, explaining the order of the Mishnah. That Tana kurve nakat. That the Tana begins letting you know those arroyos, those scenarios where the woman who's falling to Yibum is pashat the closest to you. The concept of erva, or of arroyos in plural, is that a person is not allowed to have a relation with a woman if there is a very close kinship. So there's a limit. So the closest woman with whom one is allowed to have a relation is with a niece, and then with a cousin. But when it gets closer than that, there's an isur of erva. The closest erva is a daughter. So she's pashat the closest. So the Tana mentions that group first. Now, who does daughter include? True, listen, a granddaughter is not as close as a daughter, but it's in that category. So we mentioned the first six, which was Bitai, the daughter, Bas Bitai, the daughter of the daughter, Bas Benoi, the daughter of the son, the Kroive Atzmai, and they are closer to him because it's not about them being the wife's daughter, it's about them being his daughter with or without or outside of marriage. And once we mentioned 3 generations, lamata didei, we mentioned his 3 generations. So now we go on to the wife, tananami shleish leris lamata dida, one's wife's daughter or granddaughter. So that's the next 3. So we have 6. Va'aida the tani doris lamata dida. Now that we mentioned 3 generations from the wife, the daughter, and the granddaughter, so now let's mention 3 generations going up. Right, the mother-in-law and the mother of the mother-in-law, or the mother of the father-in-law. And now, it's really what's closer than a mother-in-law is a sister. True. So why did we mention the group of the mother-in-law before the group of the sisters? Because when it came to the daughter, which is the closest daughter, we went down more than 1 generation. By sisters, you can't go further than 1 generation. So we wanted to make it symmetric if you're going down more than 1 generation. So we mentioned the group that you can go up more than 1 generation. Mother-in-law and the mother of the mother-in-law. And now v'tana chaysai, so now we go back to the closest. Who's closer? Who's the one that's closer after a daughter? A sister. So v'tana chaysai. And once he mentions sisters, we mention everyone that's a sister. In other words, it's your sister or it's your mother's sister, right? So achaysai v'achaysimai, the krevei atzmai. And once v'aida the aida be'isur achva. And now going back to the question of the Gemara that everything is learned from Achai Sisha, since we have mentioned the group of sisters, so we mention your wife's sister. Now really, Gemara says, one detail doesn't exactly fit, because ubedinhu, really, according to this logic, that the 15th case of the Mishnah should have come before the 14th case of a Mishnah. The prohibition and the exemption of doing yibum with your daughter-in-law should come before the 14th case, which was when 2 brothers did not live simultaneously. That was the 14th case. So when Reuven died, and when Reuven's widow needed to do yibum, the only brother of Reuven then was Shimon. Later on, a 3rd brother was born, and then Shimon also died after he did yibum with Reuven's widow. So now the Mishnah teaches you that Levi, who would have had a mitzvah of yibum, because Shimon's wife is a widow, cannot do yibum with her because she's also Reuven's ex-widow. And Reuven was not alive at the same time. That should have been mentioned the last. Because there is no blood closeness in the case of it's farther away of your brother's ex-wife. A daughter-in-law is closer. Ela aida da aida be isur achva tana eshes achiv shaloi hayabaylamei. But again, since we mentioned the group of brothers, so the 14th case of the widow of your non-contemporary brother is also in the group of brothers. And then v'hadatari kalosai. And that's the conclusion. In other words, the logic, the reason why the Seder, the order of the Mishnah is the way it is, the general is that Tana kurvei naka. The Tana mentions those arayas that are blood relatives closest to you, and we go from there outwards. And that works out the order. So now that we explained the order of the Mishnah, now the Gemara asks, so my iria, the Tani Poitrais, what did the Mishnah say? The Lashon of the Mishnah was, Chamesh Esrei Nashim Poitrais Saraseim. They exempt even their co-wives. So 1 second, let me ask you a question. Is the Mishnah telling you that in a case of an erva, you are exempt? Or is the Mishnah really telling you that in the case of an erva, you are prohibited? Because don't forget, if you are not obligated to do yibum, then the isur of erva remains. And if the isur of erva remains on that widow, then it's not just that you are exempt. You're not allowed to. So the first question of the Gemara is on the Lashon of the Mishnah. Why do you use the word poitrais? Say asurais. She's prohibited. And this even goes on the co-wife. Because we learned in the Mishnah that whenever one cannot do yibum on one of the wives of the brother, because that one of the wives was an erva from the 15 possibilities, then you cannot do yibum even with the co-wife. And that should also be prohibited, as we'll learn later in the Gemara from Achai Sisha. So the Gemara answers that if the Tana would have used the word oisrais, havamina, I would have only thought that asur liyabim, that the prohibition is only to do yibum. Aval milchatz cholza, but there is still an obligation to do the other option of yibum, which is taking off the shoe, removing of the shoe, which is called chalitza. Now don't forget, the Mishnah actually wrote min hachalitza umin hayibum. The Mishnah wrote both. But here in the Gemara, in the Havamin of the Gemara, when we asked, instead of saying poitrais, it should have said oisrais. The Gemara is also suggesting that we did not need to mention chalitza. It should have says that asurais liyabim. So the Gemara says asurais liyabim you can't write, because if you're saying the word asur on yibum, you might think that there's a permissibility to do chalitza. So the Gemara counsels that doesn't answer the question. All of that is answering why the Mishnah needs to mention chalitza. So v'litane asura lachloitz. So let the Mishnah mention asura is both to do yibum and to do chalitza. Mention taka both. But the question remains, why are you using the word poitrais? Why not use the better word, which is that there's a prohibition? So the Gemara says, no. And now that you admitted you have to mention chalitza, because if you wouldn't mention chalitza, one might have thought you're not allowed to do yibum, but you have to do chalitza.
Why would you think that?
Of course you would think that. Why would you not think that? There's a mitzvah of yibum.
The rule is when yibum is possible.
How do you know this? You know that rule from this Mishnah. But if not for the Mishnah writing that, the human logic would have said that really there's a mitzvah of yibum. Elama, you can't do yibum because she's an erva. Okay, so don't do yibum. But you have to do chalitza because there's a zika, there's an attachment. And the only way you can break the attachment is by doing chalitza. So the Mishnah has to mention the din that you cannot, that whenever there is no yibum, there's automatically no need for chalitza. The Mishnah has to mention that. If the Mishnah would have used the words asurais, not poitrais, what does asurais mean? That you're not allowed to do chalitza. That word cannot be written on chalitza. It's fantastic. Yibum means having a relation. Yeah, you cannot have a relation with an erva, even if she's also your wife's widow, your brother's widow. Doesn't matter. The Torah does not allow the erva to be overridden by the mitzvah of yibum. Good. That's asura, mishum erva. What is chalitza? You're taking off a person's shoe? What, she's saying a few psukim? She's spitting on the ground in front of him? You can say there's no need. Patura, you can't say it's asur. She's not doing anything wrong. So it says, my ka'ava, there's nothing, she's not violating anything. So therefore, you can't use the word asur on chalitza. And as we mentioned, the Mishnah has to teach you that yibum and chalitza travel together. So the only better option is to say the word poitrais. And the Gemara is still not happy. The Gemara counters alam aloi. Why can't you say asur to do chalitza? So you told me, what are they doing wrong? I'll tell you what they're doing wrong. Because im ata omer choyl tzoitz, then mis yabemes. Whenever yibum is prohibited, you can say it's asur to do chalitza. Why is it asur to do chalitza? Because if someone will witness in such a scenario, chalitza being done, what might they think? Oh, they chose chalitza, and I'm going to choose yibum. And if you're going to do chalitza, you might end up doing yibum in such a case. And yibum is taka asur because of erva. So it would make sense that the chachamim should use the words, it's asur to do chalitza. The act of chalitza in itself is not a kirva, it's not an erva, it's not a relationship. But it might lead to someone else marrying, making yibum with an erva. So back to the question. So the Gemara answers, Kivin de b'makoim mitzvahu.
I don't understand about this whole thing.
One second. Kivin de b'makoim mitzvah, hu da asira tzara, being that when is the tzara exempt of? When is she exempt of? Yibum, only in a case when there's a mitzvah to do yibum, but shaloi b'makom mitzvah, sharia, what shaloi b'makom mitzvah, we'll see this at the end of today's daf, God willing, not two brothers. There's Reuven, who has a brother Shimon, then there's Chaim, not related. Chaim marries Reuven's daughter. And Chaim marries another wife. And Chaim passes away. Reuven is allowed to marry Chaim's other wife. When is one exempt of or prohibited? Not only not to marry the widow who's an erva, but even the tzara, that's only if both of them were connected to him as being a brother-in-law. That's called b'makom mitzvah. But shaloi b'makom mitzvah, stam a man who can marry the co-wife of his daughter or the co-wife of any other ones of his ervas is sharia mishum hachi. Therefore, the Mishnah wanted to write the words poitrais and not the word asurais. Had the Mishnah used the word asurais, one mistakenly would have thought that a man is not allowed to, that even in that case there's an isur, and it's not true. So now we explain the Seder.
Why do you think that that's all
it would make sense. Also, you could think that since these two women were tzaras, it's connected to an erva. Anyway, so now we have the Seder, and now we have the word of Paitrais, and now we explain why the Mishnah needed to mention also Chalitza. We kept on saying that whenever there's no Yibum, there's no Chalitza. The Mishnah has to say that. And now the final question is, why did the Mishnah have to mention both? Right, Danny, that's what you asked. Let the Mishnah write, and we would know that whenever there's no Yibum, there's no need for Chalitza. So the Gemara answers, no, we would not know that. That even where there is an exemption to do Yibum, milchatz chalza, there is a need to do Chalitza. And the way Rashi and many other Rishonim explain, no, I would understand that if there's no need for Yibum, there's no need for Chalitza on her. But I still might have thought that there is a need of Chalitza on the tzara. Don't forget, the tzara, the co-wife, is not an erva. And even though we're going to learn in the Braisa and that Gimel Amud Beis, from the case of Achos Isha, that whenever you can't do Yibum on the widow because of erva, you don't do Yibum on her co-wife, but you would have thought that you would need to do Chalitza, at least with the co-wife, that you even though you can't be miyabim, you have to do Chalitza. So Komash Malan, so the Mishnah has to write both Yibum and Chalitza to tell you, Kol ha'oila liyibum, oila l'chalitza. It goes on the same track. Wherever there is an option of Yibum, then there is a need of Chalitza if you choose not to do Yibum. However, Kol she'eina oila liyibum, including the co-wife, as we will learn from the Braisa from Achos Isha, no Yibum and no Chalitza, not on her and not on the co-wife, no Yibum on the co-wife. So Eino Oila Chalitza. So now comes the final question. Okay, now that we did go hand in hand, just the order is out of place. Going back to the Seder. What comes first, Yibum or Chalitza? So, Yibum is the mitzvah. Chalitza is if, the way the Torah words it, if he doesn't want to do it, and the whole conversation is almost like a shameful conversation, that you did not want to give a name to your brother. It sounds like Yibum is the Iker. Chalitza is, they didn't want. So, Litani min ha-Yibum and a-Chalitza. The Mishnah should have said, Chamesh esrei nashim poitras tzaraseim, v'tzaras tzaraseim, min ha-Yibum and min ha-Chalitza. And what does the Mishnah mention? The Mishnah mentions Chalitza before Yibum. So answers the Gemara, in Ami, the second question, just say Chalitza, even better. If you're just going to say Chalitza, it's like Kal V'Chomer. If there's no Chalitza, for sure there's no Yibum. Answers the Gemara that our Tana goes by the opinion of Abba Shaul. The Amar Abba Shaul says, this is fantastic, that mitzvahs Chalitza kedemus l'mitzvahs Yibum. That really now, Bisman Hatanoim, practically speaking, as Rashi, let's read inside Rashi, all the way at the end of the page, second to last line, that Abba Shaul Omer, HaKoines Yevemtoi. If a person marries his Yevama, either Lishumnoi, because she's beautiful, or he wants to be married, so perfect, so now he has a wife, and not L'Shem Shamayim, not because he's marrying her to give his deceased brother a name amongst the Jewish people, which is the words of the Torah. If that is not his intention, so then Ki'ilu Paigeya Be'erva. Amazing. So now, don't forget, the brother's wife is an erva. This is the only erva from the 21 Aroyas that is overruled in the case of Yibum. That was the whole Chiddush of the Mishnah. Only your brother's wife is permissible. Actually, a mitzvah of Yibum. But if she's also your daughter, if she's also your mother-in-law, that was the whole Mishnah. It's an erva. But even the erva of Achos, of Eishes Ach, is only overruled if you're marrying her only because of the mitzvah of Yibum. But if you look at the words. Pagea be'erva, v'karov be'einai. Look at the words of Rashi. Liois havlad mamzer. Remember a rule. Yes. That it's not just an erva. It's an erva that has a consequence of mamzerus. To know a rule with only one exception. The rule is, whenever a man and a woman cannot have a relationship, and that relationship is called in the Torah an erva relationship, she's one of the 21 Aroyas, meaning they carry the punishment of kares. If they father or mother a child together, that child is a mamzer. There's only one exception to this rule, where there can be a relationship that's prohibited with the punishment of kares, and the child is not a mamzer. That's only if a man has a relationship with his wife, while she's a nida. Or really with a single woman, if she's a nida. Having a relation with a woman that's a nida is also with the penalty of kares, and that does not produce a mamzer. But all the other areas produce a mamzer. Says Rashi, it's karav be'enai liyas avad mamzer. I'll get to that in a minute. Okay. So 1 second, so what's the answer now? So being that already in the times of the Mishnayos, the people were not so pure-minded, totally l'shem shamayim. So Abba Shaul says, therefore, better do chalitza. Now, just to know how this evolved, the Ramah Paskins today means that we only do chalitza. By Ashkenazim, this is all based from Abba Shaul. Now, in the times of Abba Shaul says, mitzvahs chalitza koidemes liyibum. But you can do yibum, but it's not. You have to be careful. Really do it l'shem shamayim. The Ramah already paskin. Now we're going further in the history of the Jewish people that don't do. He says don't do yibum, only do chalitza. Also good to point out that the Ritva doesn't understand Abba Shaul as serious as Rashi does or as the Ramban does. The Ritva says that what Abba Shaul was saying is only midrabanan. But midoraisa, it's a full-fledged mitzvah, even if he marries her l'shem noy. The Ramban clearly writes, but midoraisa, that if a man marries the widow, his brother's widow, l'shum noy, or even l'shum ishus, he's marrying her because he wants to be married. So circumstances provided for him a case where his brother passed away, unfortunately, and now the widow, there's a mitzvah. Oh, so now he's going to get married. L'shem mitzvah is marriage. But he's not marrying her to establish his brother's name. He wants to be married. The Ramban writes that's the erva of Eishes Ach. Now we'll get back to this at the end of the shir for half time. The Noid Yehuda writes a whole tshuva. And he says the following, that if a person married did yibum with such a woman, and he had both kavanas, both, which would be something we can relate to. He's talking out the tzaddik of the times of old, that he did it only l'hakim shemachav Yisrael. He's marrying her to do a mitzvah, but he happens to want to get married, and she happens to be beautiful. So the Noid Yehuda says, in such a case where there's both, it's not a mamzer, it's still a mitzvah, which is a beautiful lesson to learn from that. In other words, he's writing that what does Rashi write? When does the Ramban paskin that it's mamash and erva if they're only doing it shaloi lishma? But if they do it both lishma and shaloi lishma, then it's already not the end of the world. We'll get back to that if you have time later.
End of the day, you do a mitzvah. So you have the right thought. So if you do the mitzvah, you did the mitzvah. Here, you're doing the mitzvah of people. You're doing the act of...
This would be an exception. There are exceptions to Hamais or Iker. And according to the Ramban... Let's slow down. First of all, we're only learning the opinion of Abba Shaul. It means it's a machlekes tanoim. Then there's a machlekes in the Rishonim if what Abba Shaul is saying is midoraisa or midrabanan. And then further, later on in the Poskim, they even want to narrow it more, that even if it's a deraisa, it's only if you're only doing it shaloi lishma. It doesn't sound as bad as it sounds initially, but yeah, this will be an exception. And everything is predicated, it's based on the fact that your brother's wife is an erva to you. That's the whole chiddush. What's the whole thing of the Mishnah? That a man's daughter-in-law, if she falls out to Yibum, the mitzvah of Yibum, no, they're not erva. It's a big chiddush that the Torah allows you to marry your brother's wife.
Just say that chalitza is the main...
So the Abba Shaul says chalitza is the main one, so that's why the Mishnah gives the seder that what? Poitra is not min hayibum and then min chalitza. Only min chalitza min hayibum. And the last Tosfos points out very nicely. The Gemara has two questions. Why didn't it say yibum first and chalitza second? And the second question of the Mishnah is, why didn't the Mishnah only mention chalitza? So Tosfos answers... The Gemara asked, why didn't the Mishnah only mention chalitza? So the Gemara answers, our Mishnah is Abba Shaul. So Tosfos points out very good that if the Mishnah only would have mentioned chalitza, so first of all, the order is clear. Chalitza is before Yibum. But why didn't the Mishnah only mention chalitza? Because if you don't also mention Yibum and place chalitza before Yibum, then you still would not know the din of Abba Shaul, which is a chiddush. Because in the wording of the Torah says do Yibum, and if not, do chalitza. So the Mishnah has to mention both, and Dafka mention chalitza before Yibum. Let's move ahead. Better, but because chalitza is a chiddush that even on the co-wife you are exempt of chalitza. Oh, so now the Gemara asks weiter.
If he doesn't want to marry her, she's ugly, then he's okay.
Yes, asked the Gemara, and this is a question that the Gemara asks every time the Mishnah gives the number. The Mishnah counted 15 arayas from the 21. Why did the Mishnah have to say the words Chamesh Esrei Nashim? The Mishnah should have says Bita, and you would have counted from the first one, from Bita until the Kalaso, you have 15. So why did the Mishnah have to say the words 15? That's one question. The next question, in that Beis in the Mishnah, after the Mishnah counted the 15, it says the words Harei Elu. These are, again, those words are extra. That's Minyana the Seifa, the words Harei Elu, Lemutimai, turning the page, so now the Gemara gives, we're going to learn in many other scenarios. So the Gemara answers, the minion of the Reisha, the minion of the Seifa, is Lemu'utei the Rav, and to exclude the case of Rav Asi. So let's move. What's the case of Rav? If a man, Reuben and Shimon is married to 2 wives. One of those wives became a Saita. The din is that until she drinks the bitter waters, Shimon can no longer have relations with her. While she was a Saita, while Shimon's wife from the 2 was a Saita, Shimon passes away, childless. So Rav holds that now Reuven, who's not allowed to do Yibum with that woman because she's still in the state of a Saita, not only is he exempt of Yibum and Chalitza from that wife, he's also exempt of Yibum and Chalitza on her co-wife. In other words, according to Rav, there is a 16th case where a person is patur mina Chalitza mina Yibum, but our Mishnah doesn't agree with Rav. Our Mishnah will hold that a person will be connected to the co-wife,
but not to the Saita.
Not to the Saita, for sure not. And that's why the Mishnah writes 15, not the case of Rav. There's another case of Rav Asi. What's the case of Rav Asi? If a man, again, Reuven and Shimon is married to 2 wives. One wife turned out to be an islandess. We mentioned that quickly yesterday. An islandess is a woman that is unable naturally to have children. And under certain circumstances, a man can claim that this marriage is retroactively nullified, but that's not the case of Rav Asi. The man knows she's an islandess, and he still, bedatoi, stays married to her, as we'll see later. Nevertheless, if now Shimon passes away, Reuven doesn't have the mitzvah of Yibum with the islandess. Why not? Because what's the lishma of Yibum? To have kids, lahakim shemach Yisrael. She cannot have kids. So again, Rav Asi says that since there's no mitzvah of Yibum on her, there's no mitzvah neither of Yibum nor of Chalitza on the co-wife. So again, la'afuke from Rav Asi.
Our Mishnah would hold that you have to do Chalitza.
Yes. No, I think on the co-wife. We'll see later. I'm not sure. There's details. Maybe a machlekes in Rishonim. No, they included it somehow in the Mishnah.
The case of our Mishnah was only where the islandess marriage was in Mekachtos.
The case of our Mishnah was an Azul Mekachtos.
Here's where it's not.
Very good. Otozai. Clear. Now says the Gemara, but Ul Rav Asi. Now don't forget, there's going to be a kasha on Rav and Rav Asi. But let's go. Ul Rav Asi lemu'utamai. Ul Rav Asi lemu'utamai. But according to Rav himself, who adds this 16th case. Rav holds of the case of a Saita. Rav Asi holds the case of an islandess, that there's also the same din of the Mishnah. So what will they explain? The number 15 or the words Elohein? It has to exclude something else.
Why? Why can't
No. According to Rav Asi, she and her tzara is takapatir mina yibam mina chalitza.
the Mishnah argues on it.
No. He's an Amayra. But you need 2 exclusions. Because there's the 15, the words Chamesh Esrei Nashim, and then you have the words Elohein. So now they're going to say this. Now if they both hold with each other, if Rav and Rav Asi agree with each other's cases, so now each one will need 2 other cases to exclude. So another case. What's the case of Miyun? The case of Miyun is, like we mentioned yesterday, in the end of the Mishnah, Shimon is married to 2 wives. One of the 2 wives was a minor, and not a minor that was married off by her father, who had the right to marry her off midoiraisa, which means the marriage is a marriage midoiraisa. But it's a case that either she was an orphan, and therefore she was married off by her mother or by her older brother, or her father had married her off before to another man, and he died or divorced her, and now she's still a minor, and now only midrabanan she married Shimon, and then Shimon has another co-wife. She did not do miyan. She was happy with Shimon. Shimon is a widow. Now that Shimon passed away, this widow, this minor, looks at Reuven, says, to him I refuse to get married. The question now will be, is there an obligation of Yibam, or at least Chalitza with the co-wife? That's another case.
Once again, how does this differ than our Mishnah case?
The Mishnah didn't mention this. The Mishnah didn't mention. The Mishnah just pointed out that whenever there is a marriage of miyun, and the woman who could have done miyun was also an erva, that was the end of the Mishnah. So then, if the husband Shimon passes away, Reuven the brother has to do chalitza with the co-wife. Here we're saying that she did miyun to the brother. So now the question is,
Can she do that?
of course she can do it.
Even though she was married willingly?
Doesn't matter.
Shimon.
Yeah, but she's still, just like when she's a minor until she becomes an adult, she can wake up one day and do miyun,
That still applies.
and that's retroactive. So she did miyun. The question is, do you have to do chalitza with the co-wife? The Mishnah gave Chamesh Esrei to teach you that you do have to do chalitza with the co-wife of this mima'enes. It's not poitreis min hayibum min hachalitza. In the case where she did miyun to the living brother, there's a ptur of yibum with this one, and there's no yibum even to the co-wife, but you have to do chalitza to the co-wife. And v'chada, that's exactly. And v'chada, the final case is l'ma'utei tzaras machzeh girushusas, which are cases like this: that a man is married again. Shimon is married to two wives. One wife.
So far, according to Rav and according to Rav.
We're going to find two other exceptions. We're looking for two exceptions to the rule of the Mishnah. Where even where there's no yibum, sometimes there's chalitza. What will be the other exception? Shimon is married to two wives. One wife, Shimon divorces. Now, if a man divorces his wife, if she doesn't have marriage to someone else, he can remarry her. But if she married someone else, then he can never remarry her. It means if she marries someone else and that someone else dies or divorces her, he's not allowed to marry her again. That's not one of the 21 aroyos, meaning there's no isur kadus, but it's a lav. Now the case here was Shimon did remarry her, but it's asur. And he has a co-wife. And now Shimon passed away. So the din here is that the person has to do chalitza with either one of the two. Imagine. Because since the marriage was a real marriage, even though it was asur, it's like a kohen marrying a divorcee. Because if he would want to divorce her, you'd have to give her a get. So since it was a marriage, yibum taki you can't do, but chalitza has to happen. So that's why the Mishnah gave both the words 15 and the words Elohein to exclude both cases. Now the Gemara says this works out if both Rav and Avasi agree with each other. But if they do not agree with each other, that means that Rav might hold that by an island is bedas. Right, you do have to do chalitza. If Rav Asi will hold that by a soita, you do have to do chalitza with the tzara, so then, even better. So then, chadem lemotei de chavrei, and v'chad lemotei, o tzaras v'me'enes, o tzaras machshe girushus asai. Notice we found four cases where, according to Rav, according to Rav Asi, and two other cases. So these are the cases that are being excluded, and that justifies the Mishnah's saying 15, or Elohein.
So 15 can exclude 2 and Elohein can exclude?
No, each one excludes only one.
But the problem is then that how do you know
Or more.
you have to do chalitza by?
There's no
You have
problem.
4 cases, right? Of those 4 cases, at least 2 of them.
Or more. The Mishnah is saying only these cases. Only these cases and not in the other cases. According to Rav and Avasi, they would hold the Mishnah does make exclusions. Forget, the word 15 can exclude 100 cases. You can exclude as many cases as you want. Forget, the question will be, according to Rav, the Mishnah says Chamesh Esrei. If Rav doesn't hold the Ravasi, let's go to Rav. How can Rav hold that a soita you have to do? Rav holds that by a soita.
If he doesn't hold a Ravasi, so then he needs another.
So you don't have to do chalitza.
Rav holds. One second. Correct. Rav holds you don't have to. Right. Rav holds you don't have to do chalitza, which means. So the question will be, why didn't the Mishnah mention this case? Why not this? That's a kasha. But let's go right. Now Tosfos speaks about it. Now Ravasi. Now the Gemara asks litninu. The Gemara asks, why didn't the Mishnah mention the case of a soita or of an island is bedas? So the Gemara answer is very good, because since the Mishnah is giving a din to tell you that not only is she exempt, but her co-wife is exempt, then the Mishnah went on. And then the Mishnah says, and then their co-wife is also exempt. The case of the co-wife is not shaykh, not in the case of a soita, and not in the case of island is bedas. There isn't such a case of tzaras tzara. Why not? Because what's the case of tzaras tzara? The case of tzaras tzara is that the only reason, let's say there were 3 brothers, right? That's what we said, Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. So let's say Reuven married, let's go back to Shimon married Reuven's daughter, and another co-wife. when Shimon dies, the only one who cannot marry the widow is Reuven, because it's her daughter. Levi could marry her. So therefore there's a possibility for Levi not to marry her. Levi married a co-wife, and Levi had another co-wife. Now Levi dies. So the Mishnah has to tell you a chiddush that Reuven cannot even marry the co-wife to the co-wife. These cases are possible when the first passing left a widow that is only prohibited because of an erva to one of the brothers, but she might be permissible to other brothers. In the case of a saita, something is wrong with her. She's also to everyone. She's a saita. When a woman cannot have children, so it's not shaykh l'hakim shemachav b'Yisrael, it's not only to one brother. So there will never be a case where there's a tzara. So that's why the Mishnah doesn't mention it. Let's move on. Let's go this easy brayse. Now the question is, going back to that Beis Amid Beis, how do you know that if there's a case of Yibum, that the mitzvah of Yibum does not override all the other arayas? Just like Yibum overrules and suspends, and perhaps not only is it doicha, but it's mater, the isur of your brother's wife. Maybe when there's Yibum, maybe you can make Yibum with your daughter. Maybe you can make Yibum with your daughter-in-law. Maybe you can make them with your mother-in-law. How do you know that the mitzvah of Yibum does not overrule any other of the arayos? So it says in the Brayse the Tana Rabbanan. So this is learned out from the one case of the isur erev of marrying your wife's sister. It says Isha elachayis lisikach. Don't marry your wife's sister. Again, when she's living. Litzroir, we're going to see, means even her co-wife. That's the co-wife. Legalois ervasa, to have a relation with her. Oleha, the word oleha is totally extra. Bechayeha, while she's living. As we mentioned before, the only erva that becomes permitted to a person is the erva of your wife's sister. That a man cannot marry his wife's sister as long as his wife is alive, whether married or not even married to her. A man divorced his wife, he can never marry her wife's sister when the wife or the ex-wife is alive. Bechayeha, if the wife or the ex-wife passes away, then you could marry the wife's sister. The question is, Allah matamad leimer. The word Allah is totally extra, and everything is learned from the word Allah. So the Gemara says, because the Torah is hinting to you, the word Allah is written by the mitzvah of Yibum. Lefi shenemar Yevamos yavoi Allah. So Shemei ani. You might think, afilu ba'achas mikol arayis amuras b'toira kosav medaber. You taka would have thought that maybe Yibum is even with an erva. So therefore it says here, by the sister, by the erva of achois isha, it says the word oleha, and it says by the mitzvah of Yibum the word oleha to teach you malahalan by Yibum. B'makim mitzvah, the whole Yibum is to do a mitzvah oleha. Afkan, the isur of erva, afkan b'makim mitzvah, that even in a place where there is a mitzvah, because she fell into Yibum, still the Torah says loy sikach. So this is the only erva where the Torah says that even with a mitzvah, you're not allowed to marry your wife's sister. So the Gemara says ve'enli elahi. How do you know that the exemption goes even on her co-wife? Let's finish the brayso.
Because the sister's married to your brother?
Yes, sarasa mean no, because you're married to her sister. You are married to her sister. The one who's going to make Yibum is married already to the sister. So how do you know that you are exempt even in the tzara? Talmud Leimer litzroid. The Torah says the word litzroid. The ainli elot tzarasa. How do you know that the co-wife of the co-wife as well? Tzara tzarasa minayin. So the Gemara answers, but Brayse says, because the Torah could have says the word lotzur, which means don't do Yibum even with the tzara. The word litzroir, there's an extra letter here that's to include the co-wife of the co-wife. And now the Brayse continues. Here we're speaking about the one erva scenario that you're not allowed to marry your wife's sister. Shara rois minayin, that Yibum does not overrule other arayos. So Amart, I'll tell you that ma achais isha is miyucheda, she's unique. How is she unique? That she's an erva. And what's the meaning of an erva? That at least there's the punishment of kares. V'chayav and also the kares. Or if there's a relation by accident, there's a chatos. And va'asura liyavam. And you are not allowed to do mitzvahs yibum. Af kol shehi erva. Any other case where there's a woman, that is an erva. Meaning that v'chayav and also the kares. And on shagig chatos, asura liyabim. And now the Brayse continues, ve'enli Elohim. But how do you know that they're tzara? And the exemption of the co-wife goes also to the other arayas. Same thing. Minayin Omar, I'll tell you. She erva. And and not only is she usher to do yibum, but also the Torah says the words litzroid vitzaras asura is afkoil, that if there's an erva and there's an isur kares v'zaden and there's an isur chatas b'shaygig, there's a punishment. And vasura liyabim tzaras asura mikan amru chachamim. This is the base that the sages said that there's a possibility for 15 women to become widowed and to fall to the mitzvah of yibum, but they will be an erva. Chamesh esrei noshim peturais. Not only them, but they exempt their co-wives and the co-wives of their co-wives, both from chalitza and from yibum, and ad ha'olam. Tzaras until the end of the world. What we said before, the Mishnah says afilu meya. Here it's ad ha'olam. Yachol sh'ani marba af sheish arois chamuris me'elu. And you might think that this should include the other 6, like we mentioned in the Beis Amud Aleph. If there's no mitzvah of yibum, how do I know again? Reuven and Chaim. Reuven is married. Chaim married Reuven's daughter. They're not related, Chaim and Reuven. And Chaim married also another wife. And Chaim passes away. No mitzvah of yibum. Maybe Reuven, who's not allowed to marry Chaim's wife, which is his daughter, maybe he should never be allowed to marry Chaim's other wife. But you could. So how do you know? Maybe be marba afshei sharois chamuris me'elu sheyut sorasei masurais even when there's no mitzvah of yibum. So Amar, I'll tell you, no. Reuven can marry Chaim's co-wife, even though Chaim was also married to his daughter, because ma'achais ishtoi miyuchedes she erva. That where is there a prohibition? When does the Torah say you cannot marry their co-wives? The Torah said it when it came to the case of marrying your wife's sister. That's an erva case. The Chayavin, Kares, or Chatas. And she could marry the other brothers. But we say, right, Reuven married Shimon's daughter. Reuven can marry Shimon's daughter. It's the case of Yibum. Vasur liyavam, but if he passes away, then the father cannot do Yibum. And also he's not to do Yibum or Chalitza with the co-wife. Afkol shehi erva. And there's Zadin Kares and Shagig Chatas, and she could marry other brothers. Only there do you have the Isur of Yibum and Chalitza. However, Yatsu Sheisharais Chamuras Me'elu, Hoyel V'di'ef Shelin Osila Achim. Over there, in the case that we gave, right, that she's not allowed to marry any of the brothers, or the Isur for a man to marry his daughter is equal to everyone. I cannot marry my daughter, you cannot marry your daughter. Has nothing to do with Yibum. So therefore, Tzarasei Mutarais. So Chaim marries Reuven's daughter. Okay, that's not a Yibum case. And then Chaim passes away. Reuven can marry the co-wife. She'ein tzara ela mi'ach. Period. Now, Hazara Shamanu Einish Binayin. How do you know that there's going to be the punishment if you do marry an erva of the 15th? How do you know that you'll be punished still with kares? You might think, since it's still a mitzvah of yibum, maybe the mitzvah of yibum at least weakens the isur of erva. So the Gemara says, no, it says, ki koil ish, the word koil. Ashayasem mikol hatoevas, anyone who's going to marry these close women, any avrois will get kares. And the word koil is to teach you that even if there was a mitzvah of yibum, no, that's for the 15. And in the case of the 15, let's say if a guy violated that, and he married the erva, you would think, okay, he married his daughter, but maybe he's not going to get kares, because the daughter is also, or the tzara. By the tzara there's no kares. Just there's no obligation of yibum, and therefore there's no obligation for chalitza. So the koil is to tell you that there's isur of kares. That's the end of the bais.